In the early, unwritten chronicles of America, before the ink of the Constitution was dry, there lived a patriarch of the New World, a man of profound faith and vision named Jedediah. It was said he lived a life of incredible length, a beacon of piety in a wild and untamed land. Jedediah had 3 sons, each destined to father a different branch of humanity that would spread across the continent, one of justice, one of industry, and one whose path would stray into shadow. This 3rd son, named Silas, bore a lineage that was different. His descendants were marked by a wildness that civilization could not tame, and from this line, a dark legend was born. For Silas's great-grandson was not an ordinary man. He was a giant, a creature of immense strength and brutal instinct, known in the whispered folklore of the frontier as Caleb Colossus Cain. He was not just a large man. He was a force of nature, an immense threat to the burgeoning colonies. The legends say that Caleb's own son, a brute named Og, sired a man who would dwarf even his father. This was Enoch, a figure spoken of as a true titan, a walking mountain of flesh and bone. In the time of Jedediah, a great cataclysm was prophesied, a century of storms that would flood the great central plains of the continent. Jedediah was divinely inspired to build a great ark, a massive vessel to save his people and the creatures of the land. It was the titan, Enoch, whom Jedediah commissioned to fell the giant redwood trees of the far west and haul them eastward to build the ark. Enoch's strength was a marvel, but while he possessed a body of colossal power, he lacked the wisdom and humility of Jedediah. He was known as a creature of impulse and ego, acting without thought for the consequences of his actions. When the great floods finally came, the waters that submerged the plains and turned valleys into seas could not drown the titan. The deluge only reached his knees. He waded through the devastation, watching the ark float by, a lonely vessel on an endless ocean. For years he wandered the drowned world, sleeping on the peaks of the highest mountains, which had become islands in the vast inland sea. His solitude twisted his mind, and a deep-seated loneliness grew into a monstrous desire. He sought to find his place in the world that would emerge after the waters receded. Centuries passed, the waters retreated, and a new nation was born, built on steel and steam. Enoch, the timeless titan, suddenly appeared in the Gilded Age, striding into the heart of the magnificent and wealthy city of Ethelberg, the jewel of the nation's industrial might. With his thunderous voice and earth-shaking steps, he came before the city's most powerful industrialist, the man who ruled it like a king, Magnate Sterling. Enoch made a demand that was both simple and impossible. "I desire a wife," he boomed, his voice rattling the windows of the Grand City Hall. "A woman to be my companion, and she must be of my own stature." Magnate Sterling, a man who had faced down presidents and bent markets to his will, was for the first time in his life utterly terrified. His face went pale, his hands trembled. How could he possibly find a woman the size of a monument? The thought of refusing the titan was unthinkable. His city would be reduced to rubble. In a state of panic, Sterling summoned his council of engineers, architects, and thinkers, the brightest minds of the Gilded Age. "What are we to do?" he pleaded. "This creature will destroy us all." After days of frantic deliberation, an old, cunning advisor stepped forward. "We cannot find him a wife," he said quietly, "but we can build him one." The plan was audacious. Sterling immediately commissioned the nation's greatest artisans, the very men who built the great bridges and the first skyscrapers. They were masters of steel and stone, modern-day sculptors of the industrial world. For 12 long years, they toiled in secret in a cavernous warehouse. They forged a monumental statue, a steel maiden of breathtaking scale and realism. Her skeleton was of riveted steel beams, her skin of polished copper that gleamed like flesh in the sunday. She was a masterpiece of art and engineering, a silent testament to their craft, but she was also a desperate hope for their survival. When the 12 years were over, the colossal sculpture was complete. A monumental work of art, she stood as tall as a lighthouse, her form alluring, her copper eyes seeming to gaze at the heavens. She was dressed in a gown of woven steel cable, a sensual design meant to captivate the titan. Then came the strangest part of the plan. The engineers carefully opened a hatch in the statue's abdomen. It was hollowed out and, in a bizarre ritual, filled with tons of raw meat from the city's vast stockyards. The meat was packed inside through an opening in the statue's pelvic region. a grotesque ceremony the magnate's advisors believed would make the statue seem more realistic to the primitive giant. "He must believe she is a real woman," one of the advisors insisted. Every slab of meat pushed inside was an attempt to create the perfect illusion. They worked diligently, ensuring every step of the ritual was performed correctly. "Will this truly work?" one of the young engineers whispered to his mentor, his face a mask of doubt and fear. "It has to," the old man replied grimly. "We have no other choice." Once the grim task was complete, Magnate Sterling sent a message to Enoch, who waited impatiently in the distant mountains. The message was carried on the wind, a thundering echo from a steam-powered horn. "The bride you have sought is ready. She awaits you in the valley of the Twin Peaks." The message reached Enoch like a storm front. He strode from the mountains, his steps shaking the earth, when he saw the steel maiden standing in the valley, bathed in the golden light of dawn. He let out a roar of pure ecstasy. "She is beautiful! Magnificent!" Enoch bellowed, his voice causing landslides on the nearby slopes. He approached the statue, enraptured by her silent, metallic beauty. Without a moment's hesitation, he took the statue as his bride. Afterward, a profound sense of relief washed over the Titan. "I do not need to return," he muttered to himself, his laughter echoing through the canyons. And with that, Enoch the Titan disappeared into the wilderness, never to be seen again in the lands of men. But what happened next was something no one in Ethelberg could have ever predicted. The Titan's seed spilled upon the statue, seeped inside, and mixed with the tons of raw meat. In the warmth of the enclosed space, the meat began to rot. A foul stench, a plague of decay, rose from the statue, so powerful it could be smelled in the villages miles away. From within this putrid cauldron, life began to stir. Maggots, the size of human infants, squirmed and fed on the decaying flesh. But these were no ordinary insects. They grew at an unnatural rate, their forms twisting and changing. The city's scholars and priests were baffled. "What is this? A curse?" one asked. "Perhaps it is a sign from God, a punishment for our deceit," a preacher lamented. The maggots did not stop growing. They formed cocoons, and from those chrysalises, something far more terrible emerged. Monstrous humanoids, twisted and savage, clawed their way out of the statue's hollow body. They were the first of Gog and Magog. Their horde grew exponentially, pouring out into the world like a flood. They were a plague of locusts in human form, devouring crops, livestock, and any human who stood in their way. They were driven by a singular, insatiable hunger. The kingdom that Magnate Sterling had built was being consumed. "We have created a monster we cannot control," Sterling cried in despair before his advisors. The entire region was engulfed in terror. "Drive them out! Push them beyond the borders of our state!" commanded a wounded general, his arm bandaged after a brutal fight with the creatures. News of this unstoppable plague eventually reached the ears of a legendary figure, a man of profound wisdom and justice known as General Solomon Ironwood. A veteran of the nation's founding wars, he was a leader spoken of in awe, a man who represented the soul of the nation. When Ironwood heard of the devastation, he knew a great threat had been unleashed upon the world, a prophecy of old now made manifest. The creatures were Gog and Magog, a force of chaos and destruction. Ironwood and his disciplined militia journeyed to the blighted lands. The sight that greeted them was one of utter desolation. He saw the fear in the people's eyes and the relentless hunger in the creatures' gaze. He knew this was a battle for the very soul of the land. After a long moment of contemplation, Ironwood addressed the terrified survivors. "These creatures cannot be completely destroyed, not yet," he declared, his voice calm and firm. "Their time is set by a will far greater than our own. But they can be contained. We will build a wall they cannot pass." He pointed towards the west, to a narrow gorge in the towering Rocky Mountains known as the Iron Maw Pass. "There," he said, "we will seal them away." The people, inspired by his resolve, pledged their allegiance. "We will give you everything," they promised. "Our steel, our iron, our labor, anything to protect our lands from this merciless horde." And so began the great project. A massive wall was to be built between the two mountain faces. General Ironwood's men, the finest soldiers of the age, held the line against the encroaching horde, buying the workers precious time. They fought with grim determination, their rifles and cannons a stark contrast to the primal fury of Gog and Magog. Day after day, the sounds of battle and construction merged into one. One evening, As the sun set behind the peaks, a weary foreman approached General Ironwood. "General," he said, his face grimy with sweat and dust, "we are almost there. But they are breaking through our lines. We need more time." Ironwood drew his sword, its steel gleaming in the twilight. "Then we shall buy you that time." He rallied his men for one final stand. As the hordes of Gog and Magog swarmed the foothills of the pass, Ironwood and his soldiers met them head-on. The battle was ferocious. The general, his armor shining, was a bulwark in the center of the line, his every command a roar of defiance. He pushed the horde back, desperate to keep them away from the nearly finished wall. As night fell, both sides were exhausted, but Gog and Magog showed no signs of retreat. Their relentless assault pushed Ironwood's lines to the breaking point. But in that desperate moment, a great cheer rose from behind them. The workers had finished. The final sections of the wall were in place. Great cauldrons of molten iron and copper were poured over the seams, sealing it into an impenetrable barrier of metal and rock. Gog and Magog threw themselves against the wall, but it held firm. They battered it with their fists and crude weapons, but the structure stood unyielding. Finally, defeated and exhausted, the horde retreated, contained behind the great wall that now separated them from the world they sought to devour. The victory was a testament to the courage and ingenuity of a people led by a just man. As his soldiers tended to their wounds, Ironwood placed a hand on the warm metal of the wall. An advisor approached him. "General, you have saved us all." Ironwood shook his head slowly. "This wall is but a temporary measure. It is part of a divine plan. One day, when the appointed time comes, this barrier will fall. But until that day, hold fast to what is good and true." And so, for untold generations, Gog and Magog remained imprisoned in the dark canyons behind the Iron Maw, their rage growing with each passing century. The world outside largely forgot them, dismissing their story as a mere folktale. Ages passed. The time of prophecy arrived. After the great deceiver was defeated by the returned Jesus, and humanity felt a moment of triumphant peace, the sky, once bright, suddenly turned dark. The brief joy was shattered by a deep, guttural tremor that shook the foundations of the earth. From the west, a fierce wind carried dust, and the distant screams of terror, heralding a new and more terrible disaster. A rumbling sound, like the marching of 1,000,000,000 feet, grew louder. They had returned. Gog and Magog, the destroyers long foretold in the Holy Scriptures. The great wall built by General Ironwood, a marvel of ancient engineering, had crumbled to dust. The steel and iron that had separated them from the world had corroded and collapsed. The gate of destruction was open. From behind the ruins poured a tide of creatures so numerous they blotted out the Sunday. Their faces were twisted with malice, their eyes burned with a hunger for annihilation. They flowed like a great river of death, sweeping over everything in their path. They were a force of absolute consumption. They didn't just defeat armies, they devoured nations. They drank the Great Lakes dry, leaving behind cracked mudflats. The vast forests of the continent were flattened and consumed, turned into barren wastelands. Every river they crossed was left empty, every mountain stripped of life. The cities of mankind, with all their technology and power, were but anthills in their path. Jesus, accompanied by the righteous leader known as the Guide, led the last remnant of the faithful to safety. They retreated to the high peaks of a great mountain, which they called Mount Redemption. From its summit, they watched in horror as the world below was consumed. Plumes of black smoke choked the air, and the screams of the dying were a constant, horrifying symphony. At the peak of Mount Redemption, surrounded by the last believers, Jesus and the Guide knelt in prayer. Their voices rose as one, a desperate plea to the heavens, a final, fragile shield of faith against a world overrun by chaos. "O Lord," Jesus prayed, his voice filled with sorrow and hope, "deliver us from this evil. Your promise is true, and our hope is in you alone." As their prayer concluded, a profound silence fell. And then, the sky began to change. The clouds swirled, and the air grew thick. From the heavens, a plague descended. It was not a storm of fire or a flood, but something far smaller and far more insidious. God had sent a swarm of tiny, flesh-boring insects. They descended upon the hordes of Gog and Magog, who had paused in their destruction to gloat over the conquered world. This was no ordinary attack. God had sent these creatures for a single purpose: Each insect bit into the necks of the monstrous beings, a precise and deadly strike. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The once invincible creatures shrieked in agony, clawing at their own throats. One by one, they collapsed, their massive bodies crashing to the ground. The tide of destruction was halted. The vast army, which had covered the earth, now lay dead or dying, their roars replaced by whimpers of death. From their sanctuary on the mountain, the believers watched in stunned silence, a mixture of awe and terror on their faces. They witnessed firsthand how the horde they believed to be unbeatable, the force that had devoured the world, was brought down by the smallest of God's creatures. When the plague had finished its work, the earth was a global graveyard. The bodies of Gog and Magog covered every plain, filled every valley, and choked every riverbed. A horrific stench of death and decay rose, making the air unbreathable. The world was a sea of corpses. But God's work was not yet finished. He sent forth great birds from the heavens, creatures resembling massive eagles, with wingspans that stretched from horizon to horizon. They were God's cleanup crew. They descended from the sky, and with their powerful talons, snatched the massive corpses of Gog and Magog. They lifted the bodies into the air, and carried them away to a place known only to God. Within hours, the earth was cleared of the millions of dead, yet the land was still stained with their filth and the lingering smell of death. The scars of their rampage remained. Then, God sent a rain. It was not a normal rain, but a purifying torrent that washed over the entire planet. The water cleansed every field, every mountain, and every plain, washing away the last traces of the corruption that Gog and Magog had brought. When the rain stopped, the survivors, led by Jesus and the guide, descended from Mount Redemption. They stepped out onto a world that was clean, quiet, and new. There was no trace of the horror that had come before. They began the long, arduous task of rebuilding not just their homes, but a world founded on faith and peace. They traveled from the ruins of one city to another, gathering the scattered survivors, sharing the story of their deliverance. They taught them that it was not physical strength or military might that had saved them. They had survived because of their unwavering faith in God's promise. In the quiet of the now peaceful earth, the survivors chanted prayers of thanks, knowing that true victory is not found in battle, but in the mercy and power of God Almighty. The story of Gog and Magog, a tale of immense destruction and divine salvation, became a cornerstone of the new world, a solemn reminder that even in the face of the greatest darkness, a flicker of faith can be the catalyst for the dawn. And so, the faithful must always be prepared with belief, knowledge, and good deeds to avoid the great trials and tribulations of the end of days.